concepts that Schumpeter developed, but also the history behind the person. He and I have sat down and we didn't really talk very much about the contents of Schumpeter's work, but we exchanged a lot of gossip about Schumpeter. and Professor Scherer has just incredible knowledge of both the person, the thinking, and the place of Schumpeter in the broader context of intellectual history of economic thought. He's here to share that with us. He also happens to know the house where Schumpeter actually lived. So if any of you want to go and just look at the house, he would be happy to tell you where the house that Schumpeter lived in is. So please join me in welcoming Professor Scherer.
Thank you very much, Kalestis. It's a pleasure to be here. And those of you who are coming from other nations, I welcome you here. I've been listening to the presentations this afternoon with great interest. I noticed that there are two main themes. They're about technologies and the role that Schumpeter's analysis might play in those technologies, and about nations, and again where Schumpeter might come in. So I thought I would provide some product differentiation by talking about Schumpeter, the economist, Schumpeter, the man, and just a very little bit about Schumpeter and policy. Schumpeter was born in 1883 in February. John Maynard Keynes was born 4 months later in June of 1983. And in the year 1983, Forbes magazine, on the anniversary of the centennial of the births of these two great individuals, had a cover story. The headline read, "Schumpeter versus Keynes. Who was the 20th century's greatest economist?" Many, I'm sure, were surprised to see that Forbes magazine argued that Schumpeter, of the two, was the greater economist. And one way of showing the basis of Forbes's conclusion is obtained simply by looking at statistics for 4 prominent capitalist nations on the growth over time of gross domestic product per capita, per person. And I have United Kingdom, which led at the beginning of the 20th century, and then the United States, which came from behind shortly after the dawn of the 20th century, France, which lagged a little bit all that time, but grew fairly well, and Japan, which was doing quite well with its Meiji restoration policies, then of course suffered the catastrophe of World War II, but then came back in a flurry of spectacular growth. And what Schumpeter was really all about was the source of this tremendous growth over time. Here's another view only of the United States, which says pretty much the same thing. We see a growth from a GDP in 1870 of in constant dollars of about $2,500, up in 1994 to about $23,000, an almost tenfold increase in purchasing power per person in the economy. That's, said the Forbes magazine, that's what Schumpeterian economics was all about. Now, Keynes had something very important to offer too. The economy, any capitalist economy, could get off the track. We're currently off the track badly right now. But any economy could get off the track and suffer the kind of recession that one sees for the United States in 1929, 1937, where we lost, in effect, 10 years of Schumpeterian growth. On the other hand, we did bounce back very smartly and got back on the same growth trajectory after World War II. So I'll leave that on. That's essentially why Keynes was all about the sharp recession that occurred in 1929, not only in the United States, but in most of the world. Schumpeter was about the long-run trend in economic growth. Now, despite Forbes' I thought rather surprising endorsement of Schumpeter, in fact, in those early days, he was really not, he was very well cited to be sure, but he was really not considered by most economists. I don't think they would have said he was the world's greatest economist, at least during the period up to the last 10 years or so. That would have been the judgment. Let me give you a couple of anecdotal illustrations. I first decided I wanted to be, I read Schumpeter in 1954 for the first time. I fell in love with him. In 1960, I decided I really didn't want to be a business school professor. I wanted to be an economist studying the economics of technological innovation. And so the natural choice, I knew the literature quite well, the natural choice was to go to the leading disciple of Schumpeter in the United States. And I went to that person and talked to him, and he was very, very depressed. Because he worked in the Schumpeterian tradition on economic history. But the emphasis in economics around about 1960 was on mathematical economics, and the mathematical economists with whom he associated just weren't interested in what he was doing, and he was very depressed. And a couple of months later, I read in the newspaper that he had committed suicide. And I am convinced, others are not, but I was intimately involved in the story. I was convinced he committed suicide because he just was not getting professional recognition. Now, things did change. They did begin to change. Among other things, in the early 1960s, 1963 to be exact, the Ford Foundation decided that studies of technological innovation were simply not sufficient. And it gave a few of us a small grant to put together an inter-university committee on the economics of technological change. And we worked together to try to propagate studies in the Schumpeterian tradition. And then we called a big conference that had almost all of the leading personages in this field. And we, I think, got a lot of interest going. But it probably took another 20 years before the economics profession really put Schumpeter in the lead. Well, if even today one can argue Schumpeter versus Keynes, but that's just an empty argument. Now let me give you just a few biographical details. He was born in a small town in what is now the Czech Republic. It was part of Austria at the time, but Trest, now in southern Moravia. His father died when he was quite young. He moved to Vienna and attended the best gymnasium in Vienna, and then went on to study law and economics at the University of Vienna. And then he moved into teaching. There were a few detours, but I'll ignore them. He moved into teaching. His first teaching assignment was at the University of Czernowitz, which at that time was part of the Austrian Empire, but is now a part of Ukraine. And Schumpeter really took his teaching seriously. He prepared a big reading list, and he said to his students, I expect you to read everything on this reading list. The books are in the library. So the students started filtering back to him and said, we go to the library, but the librarian will not give us access to the books. So Schumpeter went to the librarian and said, what's going on? My students need those books. And the librarian said, you know what students do to books? They write in them, they tear them, they forget to bring them back. They can't be trusted with books. Schumpeter said, you must give them access to the books. The librarian took that as an insult to his honor, that he would demand that the students, that his opinion be contravened and that students get access. So in Austria in those days, when your honor was insulted, you fought a duel. Now it so happened that Schumpeter, who had been, as I said, at the best Vienna gymnasium, had studied, among other things, fencing at the gymnasium, and was a fairly good swordsman. The librarian was not. And therefore, Schumpeter quite quickly nicked the librarian in the face and drew a little bit of blood. This question of honor was settled, and the students got access to the books. After that, Schumpeter went to the University of Graz, and then World War II was on and then ended. I'm sorry, World War I was on and ended. Austria was in terrible shape. It had lost its empire. Schumpeter then became finance minister of the downsized Austria. And to put it very simply, it was catastrophic. He only lasted 1 year. He left in a scandal and then became a merchant banker in Vienna. But the economy was very bad in Austria then, and the bank soon went bankrupt. I suppose providing a model for European banks all over today. In any event, that was very difficult for Schumpeter. He did recover by getting a new teaching position at the University of Bonn in Germany, I guess now best known as the birthplace of Beethoven. And then in 1932, he accepted a professorship at Harvard University, a small college in Massachusetts, and remained there until his death in 1950. Now, here's just a little bit of what Calestis showed. This is where Schumpeter lived first after he was married. It's just, you go out to Mount Auburn Street around the corner here, turn left past the post office about 2 blocks, turn right onto Ash Street, and this charming little bungalow was the first residence Schumpeter owned and occupied with his wife, Elizabeth Booty Verkusi. And then they moved around the corner to Acacia Street to an absolutely huge house how two people could fill that big house, I just cannot understand. Now it's been redeveloped as a multi-family residence, but they did, and that was his second residence. I guess the explanation is that Schumpeter always did things up in a grand way. And when he was still in Austria, he observed that he had three ambitions in life: to be the greatest horseman in Vienna, the greatest lover in Austria, and the world's greatest economist. And he said much later that he was sorry he had only achieved two of those three goals. He didn't say which. I could present some speculation, but I will not. Well, here's a brief summary of his principal books. The first book was sort of just a survey of the literature, a gigantic survey.